Replacement windows. Not in your budget this year? Well, what if you could save 20%? Renewal by Andersen, full-service replacement window division of Andersen, are putting windows back in your budget with this exclusive podcast-only offer. You know how much I love this and what a difference it makes. You owe it to yourself, people. You save 20% on windows, 20% on patio doors, an additional $20 on every window. Don't settle for low-end vinyl windows. Renewal by Andersen's composite Fibrex window material is 2 times stronger than vinyl, and you can save 20% on windows and patio doors, plus an additional $20 off each and every window with 0 down, 0 payments, and 0 interest for a year. The air conditioning works better. It's so much quieter. The heater's better. Everything is better. Dust is down. So for a free renewal by Andersen Windows Diagnosis, call 1-800-406-8700. Again, 1-800-406-8700. 1-800-406-8700. Dawson.
Offer not available in all areas. Restrictions and conditions apply. Call for license information.
TCL is a proud sponsor of the 1500 ESPN studios. TCL, America's fastest growing TV brand. Minnesota Vikings, the NFL, football. Yeah, football. Welcome to Purple Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Purple Podcast. Matthew Coller here, and it's been a little while since we have checked in with the O-line guy of the podcast, Brandon Thorn, USA Football, along with other various outlets. You can follow him on Twitter at Veteran Scout. My favorite go-to guy for offensive line and defensive line work. Brandon, how are you?
I'm doing good, Matt. Excited to be here. This is a big, exciting game we're going to talk about, so it's always good.
So I remember last year you and I got together and we talked about the Saints and the Vikings, how they match up in the trenches before the divisional game last season. And the Minneapolis Miracle is what comes out of that game, and everything else sort of is a blur. But if I recall, the Saints got the best, I think, of both sides of that matchup for most of the day. So tell me, before we get into sort of player by player, what you think of the big picture on the Saints offensive defensive line and the Vikings offensive defensive line, kind of where they stand within the league, how you think they're playing overall, and what we should look for.
Yeah, so, with the Saints, I think their offensive line right now is, firmly inside the top 5 in the NFL. You can make that case they were last year as well, but, they still have kind of a little bit of a revolving door at left guard, with Pete, continuously dealing with injuries, but it hasn't really slowed him down. Everybody else has played, and they have a really strong unit across the board, bookend tackles and a good interior. So, yeah, the offensive line is stout, and they're playing really well this year, in the run game and in pass protection. I think they've given up the fewest quarterback hits, which I know is partly on Drew Brees too, but so, in Teron Armstead, I just wrote a big piece on him that's coming out soon and got to talk to him, about what's going on this season. And this is, the best start that he's had in his career. So, with Everson Griffin coming back, on the Minnesota defensive line, most likely he'll go into his right defensive end position, and that matchup is going to be key. Like it was last year in the playoffs. I just went back and watched every snap of that before we got on the phone, and, I thought Armstead definitely got the better of that matchup. Griffin got a sack on him, got a really great jump off the ball and just beat him, but aside from that, didn't really get close to Breeze. So that's going to be a matchup to watch. I'm sure there's going to be a little bit of rust there, and, coming back against Armstead, that's going to be tough for Griffin, but, it just takes 1 or 2 plays and, it could be a pretty decent game for him. So that matchup, individually is one of my favorites in this game. But, the Vikings defensive line is, they're getting stronger, it seems like. Linval Joseph missed the first game he has since, I think, 2015 season last week, which was, I think, kind of unexpected. But I saw that I think he did practice yesterday.
He did, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so that's good. He'll probably be back. So, him being in or not is huge for that defensive line. He's kind of this, not just literally the centerpiece, but, just kind of that unmovable object in the middle that he gives Unger a lot of problems, the Saints center. So, if he's playing, I think that's going to make a world of difference. But then, to have Sheldon Richardson in there instead of Tom Johnson, that's going to be somebody that the Saints didn't see last year. So that's going to be a new dynamic there in the middle against Larry Warford and, Andrus Peat, who's supposed to play, which he didn't play in the playoff game last year either. So, yeah, and then, Danielle Hunter going back over to the left defensive end spot, going against Ryan Ramczyk, that's a great matchup. So just really, really good matchups on the ends, I think, and then on the interior as well. So the Saints offensive line versus Vikings defensive line, I think, is definitely, the premier matchup of the game. And then it's a little bit more in favor, I think, to the Saints on the opposite sides of the ball. I just think their defensive line is solid, but, Cam Jordan last year was, a superstar. This year he's still very good. And, going against, I guess, Brian O'Neill, that's going to be, a really tough matchup for O'Neill because, the primary area that he struggles is dealing with guys who are extremely powerful and can convert speed to power really well. And I think you have to put Cam Jordan on like the top 2 or 3 list in the NFL of guys who can really convert speed to power at, a crazy rate. So that's going to be really, really tough matchup for O'Neill. I would imagine that they're going to, slide a little bit more help, give a little bit more chips, stuff like that. Because, the last couple of weeks, O'Neill hasn't really faced anybody. Arizona and the Jets don't really have anybody at left defensive end. Marcus Golden, for the Cardinals, I watched that game earlier today. He did pretty well there, but even then his bull rush got O'Neill a couple times, and it's nothing like Jordan's. So this will definitely be the toughest matchup that a right tackle has faced so far this season for the Vikings. So that really stands out to me. And then you kind of go across, from the right side. Sheldon Rankins, on the interior is a really tough matchup for guys. He has a really, really good spin move as a pass rusher. I could see him giving a lot of trouble to the interior, specifically the guards. I think Elflein has the advantage over the interior, like nose tackles of the Saints. I saw Tom Compton, he didn't practice yesterday. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
So, what would it be? Isadora maybe?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. So Rankins, has a definite advantage, I think, over him and Remmers as a pass rusher. And, and then I saw Riley Reif might play. So, if he plays, obviously that's a huge boost. And I think it'll be kind of an even matchup, for the most part on the other side. But Davenport, they also have Alex Okafor, but Marcus Davenport, their first round pick, at least the last weeks, I think 3, 4, 5, I really noticed him kind of jump off the screen, with really good power in his hands. And, he's obviously a very athletic guy. So that'll be I think a really intriguing matchup against Reif, if he plays. So I still would give the advantage to the Saints, defensive line, which I'd give the advantage to most defensive lines over the Vikings, but, Vikings offensive line. But it's, not too lopsided, I don't think, aside from that right tackle versus Jordan matchup. I think that could get a little out of control possibly, but yeah, it's going to be a great line of scrimmage battle either way on both sides.
So let me dig into a few of those things here, starting with Everson Griffin, where as we record this, it's not clear if he's going to play or not. He practiced in full, and then he talked, and it seemed like that was a possibility, but no one's saying definitively yet. So if Everson Griffin cannot play, what is the battle between Armstead and Danielle Hunter like, and how does that kind of impact the entire strength of the Vikings defensive line?
Yeah, I mean, Hunter, I think he wins more, even though he, is a very athletic guy, testing wise. I think, from what I've seen him, he wins with really good, he has a really good pass rush plan at this point. He's able to string together moves well, uses his length and his hands well. So that, to me, is almost a more interesting matchup versus Armstead. Cause Armstead is such a great athlete that, guys like Griffin with a great get off, they typically don't impact him as much. And, Hunter has a good get off, but I think he more so wins, with his length, with his dexterity. He's a really, I think a skilled pass rusher. So that matchup to me is a little bit more intriguing. And I think he could, potentially give Armstead a little bit, stress Armstead out a little bit more, actually. So, that matchup would be really intriguing. And then for the defensive line, if that happens, I guess Weatherly would, man the other side. And I think that, Minnesota would be at more of a disadvantage all around, just because I think Ramczyk, would have the edge over Weatherly. Despite Weatherly playing well and everything, I just think Ramczyk is, the more established, just better player. So maybe a little bit of a downgrade there, just on the Vikings defensive line. But, I think that left tackle versus Hunter matchup becomes a little bit more interesting at the same time.
So let me ask you about Linval Joseph and his impact. Now, he was out last week, and maybe in a way precautionary for him because they're playing the Jets. And teams will always tell you that, like, no, that's not a consideration. But, I think that it has to be when you're thinking that Spencer Long is the other team's center and David Perry can probably handle him, or Jaleel Johnson could probably handle him and do the job for a week. But then the next week you're going up against one of the best teams in the NFL, one of the best offensive lines in the NFL. If Joseph is 100%, I look at him as the guy who can entirely affect this game. Because even when you go back to the divisional playoff game, the Vikings had to stuff a 3rd down and 1 in order to get a chance to have the Minneapolis Miracle, right? And for whatever reason, the Saints decided, hey, it'll be a good idea to not have Drew Brees throw it, but rather run right at Linval Joseph. But I think that, Brandon, if the Saints can run the ball against the Vikings, which teams have not been able to do very well in a really long time since Linval Joseph has been here, but if they can with Kamara and Ingram, then the Vikings are not going to have any chance to stop Drew Brees.
Replacement windows. Not in your budget this year? Well, what if you could save 20%? Renewal by Andersen, full service replacement window division of Andersen, are putting windows back in your budget with this exclusive podcast only offer. You know how much I love this and what a difference it makes. You owe it to yourself, people. You save 20% on windows, 20% on patio doors, an additional $20 on every window. Don't settle for low-end vinyl windows. Renewal by Andersen's composite FibreX window material is 2 times stronger than vinyl, and you can save 20% on windows and patio doors, plus an additional $20 off each and every window with 0 down, 0 payments, and 0 interest for a year. The air conditioning works better. It's so much quieter. The heater's better. Everything is better. Dust is down. So for a free renewal by Andersen Windows Diagnosis, call 1-800-406-8700. Again, 1-800-406-8700. 1-800-406-8700. Dawson.
Offer not available in all areas. Restrictions and conditions apply. Call for license information.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think you have to kind of look at the linebacker play, at the same time and stopping the run and, see how they do. But in terms of just, the offensive line versus defensive line and, Linval Joseph is primarily going to be going against Max Unger. Unger is a guy who wins with, leverage, quickness. He's a very, smart guy who's been around a long time and does a lot of the little things well, but he's just, simply overmatched physically against Joseph. And, I think that shows, when you watch, them matched up against each other, as they have been in the past. Joseph just gives him a lot of trouble with his length, his strength. He gets inside of Unger, and Unger can't really, do anything. He can't really disengage off of him, break his hands off of his chest. Joseph he's just kind of dominant, on the inside. So yeah, I mean, Joseph playing, I think, makes all the difference, in just the whole defense's ability to stop the Saints offense because of that, ability to really plug the inside. And I think, even with, really good backs like the Saints have, I don't really question Joseph's ability to do his job in this game against Max Unger. So, but obviously, Joseph is really just going to kind of cover those two A gaps. So, if you're talking the B gaps, C gaps, further outside and, things like that, that becomes, team defense at that point, obviously. So, but yeah, I mean, Linval Joseph alone, I think is going to handle his own for sure on the inside there and really kind of cover up those A gaps for everybody else to, be free. And, especially the linebackers, I don't really foresee, a whole lot of, the interior offensive line being able to get up to them at the second level. And that's really what Joseph brings. He frees up linebackers to roam around.
Now, if anybody wants to do this, it's kind of a fun exercise, is to just watch Linval Joseph on plays. Like, don't look at the ball. Don't watch where it's being thrown or where it's being run. Just watch him.
I do that.
And that is what you do best, Brandon, is you focus on those guys up front. And you do it exceptionally well. And it's something that I think once you start to see it, though, you understand why things work and why things don't work and the type of impact he has and sort of the domino effect of a guy who can just overpower a center and always requires two people to block him. And then also Linval chases people down. And that's the thing, is that when he ran for a touchdown, everyone's like, oh my gosh, how fast is this guy? Like, yeah, if you watch the tape, you know that because you see all the time this guy running people down from behind.
Yeah, it's so much fun to watch, especially a guy, I mean, as big as he is, to give the effort that he gives, on a play-to-play basis. I mean, and then, just to watch Linval Joseph, like you said, if you really focus on him, you could really see his personality shine through on the field. You could tell probably, if nobody loves playing, as much as he does, just the passion he plays with and really kind of the celebrations that he does, they're very, I guess, kind of subtle, but I don't know how subtle they are. I mean, he's pretty bold about, when he makes a big play, he'll just kind of stare down the opposite sideline. He loves putting up one arm and flexing it. And nobody's going to say anything to Linval, I mean,
right.
Offenses don't really mess with him. I mean, if he makes a play, they'll just, kind of move on and let him celebrate, and I just love seeing that dynamic because he's such like a physically imposing guy who just, plays really, really hard and, has underrated athleticism for being as enormous as he is. So yeah, he's one of the more fun interior defensive linemen in the league to watch, in my opinion, for sure.
And what I enjoy about him is that he is off the field a very quiet guy and a very humble guy. I mean, you really won't find anybody who has more of a humble approach than Linval Joseph. Even after he scored the touchdown, you could tell he was really, really excited about it. But at the same time, he's not going to be the guy who comes into the locker room or in front of the media or with his teammates and tries to, pump himself up or anything like that. It's just his on-field demeanor. So it's really interesting when you watch him on the field versus the Linval Joseph that we see on a daily basis around the facility. So now let me ask you, on the offensive side, Pat Elflein coming back, to me, has been monumental for the Vikings offensive line, where at one point I would have looked at this as just an untenable situation. It was so poor for the first couple of weeks that I don't know how you're going to win any games. And then he comes back, and all of a sudden explosive runs start to happen up the middle. And, even to the outside on a play where Rock Thomas picked up 23 yards, Elflein spotted a potential tackler out of the corner of his eye and just stuck a mitt out there and got the guy off of the direction to set up the big run. I mean, the cerebral nature of him. Yeah, it was a great play, right? I mean, to see him come in, to have his head on a swivel there and just to stab the guy and keep him away from Rock Thomas. These things, I see, Brandon, just a major, major impact of Pat Elflein being there.
Oh yeah. He's, I think at this point, the best offensive lineman on the team. And yeah, he's a good to very good center at this point, I think. And his impact, I don't think could be overstated. He's, not only really good at the point of attack and, kind of generating movement and getting guys, moved off the ball to, open up some holes, kind of in the vertical run game. But what he does laterally, I think, is kind of what takes him to that next level. And he did it at Ohio State, both at center and at guard. And he's doing it now, pulling, getting out in space, being able to identify the right target, whoever's the most dangerous man. He's very good about deciphering that, lining up his targets and actually, getting to them, is a really impressive feat, for a center, because virtually every guy he sees in space is a much better athlete. So to be able to do that is really impressive. And yeah, I mean, he's one of the smartest guys, I think, at the position. And just basically what I saw at Ohio State, I'm really happy that it's translated, as well as it has. And yeah, last week, I mean, that was awesome to see. It was back-to-back clips, actually. That the run you're talking about to stab that guy. And then I think the very next play or the play before he drove his guy totally off the ball, and then they scored, I think. So I think it was back-to-back plays. His impact was clearly right there. And basically because of him, those two long runs, I think it was two runs in a row, and they got 61 yards out of it and a touchdown. Mm-hmm. And both those plays were because of Pat Elflein more than anybody else. So yeah, that was a great example of his impact. And yeah, it just changes everything for the run game. It makes him a lot more versatile and multiple, I think.
So the second one you're talking about, the Murray touchdown, what I liked about that one is when Elflein came back, his injury really kept him from working out in the offseason, and it took a long time for him to get back to his strength, and to see him drive a defensive lineman back like that to the point where I believe it cut off an angle for a linebacker to kind of get back in that play, that the linebacker had read it maybe, or a little bit over pursued, and he could have maybe jumped back and tackled Murray, but instead there was a defensive lineman's butt in his way, and he just couldn't get to Murray, and he blew right through. And something like that, we knew that Elflein would be able to get out and move still, and we've seen it, but to have his core strength, or whatever you might call it, to drive somebody back like that, I think was a really positive sign. And we are seeing him be just as good or even better than he was last year. What I'd like to see more of, Brandon, is them use him in the screen game. We haven't seen a whole lot of screens to running backs, and I know Delvin's out, but that's where Elflein, to me, is at his absolute best.
Yeah, screens or pulls, I think either one, I mean, and they've done that here and there, but yeah, I agree. I think you can definitely increase that, and I'm not sure why they haven't exactly. It's a good question. Maybe because Cook isn't in there, and, I don't know. I still agree with you, though. I think when that's the best part of your offensive line, really, is Elflein in space. So yeah, I think you should maximize that as much as possible. And, hopefully they can do that against the Saints, this week. But yeah, I think that's a great point. Pulling and screen game, that's Elflein's, bread and butter. And really, I mean, I think that fits Brian O'Neill as well. So I think it can help both of those guys.
Well, a perfect lead into my final question for you, Brandon. Should Brian O'Neill stay in at right tackle, or should they stick with Rashad Hill as the starter because he's faced off with Cameron Jordan before in the playoffs, even though he got beat a lot, but he's still seen him? And you mentioned the speed to power issue. This seems like it could go either way, where either O'Neill could have a game where he really proves that he should be in there for the rest of the year, or it's one where he could lose confidence because he's really getting slammed back into the quarterback.
Yeah, it's tough, and I could probably be convinced either way, but, I lean at this point a little bit more towards just keeping him in there, just because, he has a couple starts now under his belt, and, he's played, pretty well. But, that power thing, if he gets beat a couple of times, with the bull rush of Cam Jordan, I think that you can live with that at this point because he's doing some other things well. And I think you want to see it too. It's a primetime game. Kind of at this point, I'm becoming more comfortable with kind of putting him in a situation like that, you know, a little bit more pressure maybe. But you want to see how a guy like that responds, you know, and if it isn't well at all, you know, you can maybe put Hill back in there, you know, for a couple of weeks, let him face off against Khalil Mack, you know, in week 11, and then maybe, you know, mix, you know, O'Neal back in for the rest of the year, because you're really not going to see great pass rushers again until Khalil Mack in week 17. So, you know, I think that could be a route you go, you know, but so that's kind of what I'm leaning towards. I say you put him in there, you let him face off against an elite player, but also you don't really let him be on an island, you know, and don't do anything like that. You know, you don't want to put too much on his plate, but let him go against him a couple times in the game, you know, maybe adjust your game plan a little bit, give a little bit more help over there if you can without, you know, handicapping the offense too much, but also increase, you know, what he does well. Let him get in space, you know, a little bit more than you have in the previous couple weeks, a little bit more screens, you know, pulling, things like that. And I think, you know, you just see what happens. But yeah, I'm kind of at that point now where, you know, O'Neal's, you know, the future, you know, there. And Hill, even though he did play him last year, I mean, I think everybody knows what Rashad Hill is at this point, you know, so yeah, I do like the idea of, you know, this situation, letting O'Neal stick in there and play.
Well, I am with you, and, you know, I'm skeptical on whether O'Neal would be ready to go, but he has looked so good over the last couple of weeks. There are times where he's still getting beat, but I think it would be a great test of his progress, and he's probably the best, given the best chance considering his athleticism, and you're right about if they could dial up some things to use him in space, then I think they can have some success without having to do a whole lot at the quarterback position. That's what I love about screen passes so much, is when you have these offensive linemen who can move. I mean, all the quarterback has to do is just dump it off and then watch the rest of it happen, and that's where Case Keenum made a lot of his bones last year. So, Brandon, as always, fantastic stuff. People should follow you at Veteran Scout. You post out a lot of things that I learn from. You don't just tweet out and say, hey, look at this great play, but you explain why it's working, why certain players are good, and I think the more understanding you have of what's going on in the trenches, the more you can understand the game of football and appreciate it. So you do a great job, and thank you as always for popping on.
All right, man. Thanks a lot for having me again. Appreciate it.
And thank you all for listening to the Purple Podcast.
This is firefighter Rafael Porriette for Firehouse Subs, introducing the new Firehouse Pub Steak Sub with savory steak, crispy fried onions, and our rich Belgian beer cheese sauce. On tap for a limited time. Order yours at firehousesubs.com today. Remember, a portion of every sub you buy helps provide life-saving equipment for first responders. Firehouse Subs. Enjoy more subs, save more lives. Limited time only, plus tax. Participating locations. Firehouse Subs will donate a minimum of $1 million in 2018 to the Firehouse Subs Public Safety Foundation by donating 0.13% of every purchase.
Pipe bomb investigation. I'm Ed Donahue with an AP News Minute. More devices have been found, one in New York, two in Delaware. The White House is saying President Trump did not influence this. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat, disagrees.
Some individuals have stepped over a line, and that they are responsible for their actions. But it's also important that no one incite anyone to violence.
Mayor Bill de Blasio is reminding New Yorkers the search for a suspect or suspects continues.
The packages we've seen so far have followed a very, very specific pattern, but that doesn't mean everyone will follow the exact same pattern. That doesn't mean there won't be copycats. So the best thing is to be very cautious, and if there's doubt, reach out to the NYPD immediately.
Strong results from major companies including Microsoft, Visa, and Comcast have stocks sharply higher before the close, wiping out yesterday's big losses. I'm Ed Donahue.